Once a plea is entered and a sentence is handed down, the machinery of justice typically falls silent, its work complete. The public is left with the broad strokes of the case, the verdict, and the memories of the news reports. But in the digital age, and particularly in a case of such immense public interest as the Watts murders, a final and powerful chapter unfolds: the release of the discovery file. In the American legal system, the discovery process is a fundamental tenet of due process. It is the mandatory obligation of the prosecution to share all of its gathered evidence with the defense team. This is done to ensure a fair trial, allowing the defense to see the full scope of the case against their client, to identify weaknesses, and to prepare their strategy. When a case ends in a plea, as the Watts case did, this mountain of evidence becomes, in many states, a matter of public record, accessible through Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) requests. For the Watts case, the release of the discovery file was an evidentiary bombshell. It was not just a file, it was a digital avalanche, a multi-terabyte trove of data that contained every single piece of information the multi-agency task force had gathered. It was the complete, unredacted anatomy of a homicide investigation. Contained within this digital archive were the raw materials that would fuel the world's understanding and obsession with the case for years to come. There were hours of police body camera footage, capturing the first tense moments inside the silent house. There were the full, unedited interrogation videos, the initial soft-pedaled interviews, the high-stakes confrontation after the failed polygraph, and Chris's stunning, tearful, and fabricated confession to his father. The public could now watch in real time as his lies crumbled under pressure. The discovery also included the complete transcripts and audio of Nicole Kessinger's interviews, allowing the world to hear, in her own words, the story of her deception and her dawning horror. Most poignantly, it contained the full extraction of data from Shannon Watts' cell phone, including the final, heartbreaking text conversations with her friends, where her private fears about her marriage and her husband's growing distance were laid bare for public consumption. The cold, hard data was there as well. The GPS logs from the Anadarko truck, the financial records detailing their bankruptcy and mounting debt, and the hundreds of crime scene photos from both the house on Saratoga Trail and the desolate landscape of Survey 319. The release of this discovery material is the single most significant reason why the Watts case remains so vivid in the public imagination. It transformed the case from a story told by journalists into a story that could be examined, piece by piece, by anyone with an internet connection. It was this public access that allowed documentaries to be made with such visceral, primary source power. It was this trove of data that fueled the endless analysis on YouTube and podcasts. This unprecedented transparency, while a cornerstone of an open justice system, came at a profound personal cost to the victim's family. Their daughter's most intimate moments, her private anxieties, and the horrifying details of her last hours were now permanent, accessible artifacts, subject to endless public commentary and scrutiny. The discovery file had provided the final, undeniable truth of Christopher Watts' guilt, but in doing so, it had also turned a private family's deepest tragedy into a permanent and public possession. The moment a story like the Watts case breaks free from the confines of a local police blotter and enters the ravenous, 24-hour news cycle, it takes on a life of its own. By Tuesday, August 14th, the quiet suburban artery of Saratoga Trail had been transformed into a temporary media encampment. News vans, their satellite dishes raised like metallic sentinels, lined the curbs. Reporters, clutching microphones and trailed by cameramen, established their positions on the pristine sidewalks, their presence a stark and jarring intrusion into the neighborhood's carefully curated peace. For the veteran news producers and journalists in the Denver media market, the story was a tragically perfect storm, a confluence of elements guaranteed to capture and hold the public's attention. There was the beautiful, seemingly happy family, whose life was an open, photogenic book. There was the terrifying mystery of a vanishing, with a pregnant mother and two small cherubic children at its center. And now, There was the compelling, sympathetic figure of a young husband and father, left behind to grapple with an unthinkable void. Christopher Watts's decision to speak on camera that Tuesday evening was, from a media perspective, a programming coup. It put a human face on the tragedy, transforming an abstract missing persons bulletin into a deeply personal and emotional narrative. Local news channels broadcast his plea in its entirety, the raw footage leading their evening newscasts. "This house is not complete without anybody here," he said, his voice a practiced performance of a man trying to hold it together, looking directly into the lens and, by extension, into millions of living rooms across Colorado. And for a brief, critical window of time, the public narrative was entirely his. The story that played out on television screens was one of a family stolen, of a heartbroken husband waiting by the door for his children to run in and rush him. The public debated theories of a desperate mother on the run, of a possible abduction, of a woman overwhelmed by stress who had simply taken her children and disappeared. In this version of the story, Chris Watts was the victim, the anchor point of the tragedy. But behind the scenes, a completely different story was being written, chapter by silent, damning chapter. While television anchors were replaying Chris's emotional plea, investigators at the Frederick Police Department Command Center were listening to Shannon's friends describe a marriage that was fracturing under the weight of his emotional detachment. While the public speculated, detectives were drafting the warrants that would reveal the existence of Nicole Kessinger. And while Chris was performing his grief on his front porch, data analysts were just hours away from receiving the GPS coordinates that would pinpoint his true location on that fateful Monday morning. The result was two parallel and completely contradictory realities existing at the same time. There was the public-facing narrative of Chris Watts the victim, and the private, rapidly escalating investigative reality of Chris Watts the suspect. The narrative inversion, when it came, was as swift as it was brutal. Late Wednesday night, the story pivoted on a single, shocking word: arrest. The news alerts that flashed across phones and television screens were stunning in their reversal. The husband of a missing Frederick woman has been taken into custody, one local anchor reported, the barely concealed shock evident in their voice. Christopher Watts, in his supreme arrogance, had seen the media not as a threat, but as a tool, a powerful megaphone to broadcast his innocence to the world. He believed he could control the narrative. Instead, the bright, unforgiving light of the camera had captured every tell, every micro-expression, every slip of the tongue. He had intended to perform the role of a grieving victim for the world. Instead, he had provided the prosecution with Exhibit A of a guilty man's unconvincing lies. Among the myriad tragic details and horrifying revelations in the Watts case, the quiet, spectral presence of the family dog, Dieter, adds a particularly poignant and unsettling footnote. A small dachshund mix, Dieter was a beloved member of the Watts family, a fixture in many of Shannon's joyful family photos and videos. He was the only living being, aside from his owners, to be present in the house at 2825 Saratoga Trail during the commission of the murders. When Officer Coonrod and Nicole Atkinson first entered the home with Chris Watts on the afternoon of August 13th, one of the first things Nicole noticed was that the little dog was unsecured, roaming the house freely. This, in itself, was a small but significant anomaly. Shannon, ever the planner and a fastidious housekeeper, would typically secure Dieter in his kennel if she were to be gone for any length of time, especially with the girls. An untended dog suggested a sudden, unplanned disruption to the normal household routine. But Dieter's most significant role was as a silent, biological witness. For the duration of Chris Watts's short but horrific rampage, and for the long, silent hours that followed while Watts was at Survey 319, and then pretending to be at work, the little dog was the sole occupant of the house. He was there when his world was violently and irreversibly altered, the only living creature left behind amidst the chilling stillness. Law enforcement officers who were on the scene in those first hours noted the dog's behavior. He was not aggressive, but he was anxious and timid, sticking close to the officers and the few familiar faces he recognized. It is impossible to know what a dog senses or comprehends in such a situation. Did he hear the struggle? Did he sense the profound and terrible shift in the atmosphere of his home, from a place of loving routine to one of violent finality? Animal behaviorists would suggest that at the very least, he would have been intensely distressed by the smell of death and the profound emotional and chemical changes in his owner. Chris Watts, in his grand, psychopathic plan of erasure, had one significant blind spot. In his meticulous efforts to dispose of the human members of his family, he had completely overlooked the small, four-legged one. The presence of a perfectly healthy and unharmed family pet was a stark and jarring contradiction to any narrative that involved a struggle with an intruder, a home invasion, or a suicidal mother who had taken her own life and that of her children. An attacker would likely have harmed or killed the dog. A person in a state of despair likely wouldn't have cared for it. Dieter's presence, unharmed and unattended, pointed squarely to the one person he was familiar with and trusted, Christopher Watts. In the end, after the crime scene was processed and the house was sealed, Dieter was taken into the care of Shannon's family. He was a last, living link to the life that had been so brutally extinguished, a small, sad creature who had been a first-hand, if silent, witness to the complete and utter collapse of his world. The role of a medical examiner or coroner is to speak for the dead, to use the objective, impartial language of science to tell the final chapter of a person's life. In the Watts case, the Weld County Coroner's Office was tasked with a burden of almost unimaginable weight. Their findings would not only establish the cause of death, but would serve as the definitive, scientific rebuttal to the self-serving fiction Christopher Watts had created. The official autopsy reports, clinical and dispassionate in their language, became one of the most powerful and damning documents in the entire case file. The autopsies were conducted by forensic pathologist Dr. Michael A. Burson. Each report was a meticulous, page-by-page catalog of the physical state of the victims, a somber and detailed map of the violence they had endured. Shannon Watts's report was the most straightforward, confirming what Chris had already, in a fashion, confessed to. The cause of death was officially listed as asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. The report noted bruising on the anterior strap muscles of her neck, evidence consistent with a significant amount of pressure being applied. It also tragically confirmed that she was 15 weeks pregnant with a well-formed male fetus. This finding was critical for the prosecution, as it allowed them to file the separate and distinct charge of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, legally acknowledging the death of the child they would have named Nico. The reports for Bella and Celeste, however, were the ones that completely reshaped the legal and public understanding of the crime. Dr. Burson's examination of the girls found a notable absence of the kind of injuries that would be present in a manual strangulation. Instead, he found subtle but definitive signs of smothering. There was petechial hemorrhaging, tiny burst blood vessels in the eyes, a common marker in cases of asphyxiation. For 3-year-old Celeste, the signs pointed to a swift and overwhelming assault. The official cause of death was asphyxiation due to smothering. But it was Bella's report that contained the most visceral and heartbreaking detail. In addition to the signs of smothering, Dr. Burson documented several significant findings. He noted a frenulum tear in her mouth, an injury often seen when there is a forceful action against the mouth area. Most chillingly, he documented a series of lacerations and bite marks on the surface of her own tongue. It was a self-inflicted injury, a sign of a profound and desperate struggle against the object that was covering her face. This single, clinical finding, lacerations of the lingual frenulum and mucosal surface of the upper lip, bite marks to the mucosal surface of the tongue, was a silent scream from the autopsy table. It provided the forensic backbone for Chris's later, truthful confession. It was the scientific proof of her last, terrifying moments, a story told not in words, but in the wounds she had inflicted upon herself while fighting for her life. The toxicology reports also told a critical story, but one of absence. There were no drugs or sedatives found in the children's systems. This definitively disproved a common theory that Chris might have drugged them before the long drive to Survey 319. It confirmed that they were fully conscious, fully aware for their final, horrific journey. Ultimately, the autopsy reports were more than just legal documents. They were the victims' final, irrefutable testimony, a scientific voice that rose from the grave to expose their killers' lies and to ensure that the true, unvarnished story of their last moments was told. The physical geography of the Watts case is a tale of two starkly contrasting landscapes, a geographical and symbolic representation of the dual life Christopher Watts was trying to live. The first landscape was the carefully manicured, artificially idyllic world of 2825 Saratoga Trail in the Windham Hill subdivision of Frederick, Colorado. The second was the desolate, industrial wasteland of the Survey 319 oil field, a place defined by its raw, utilitarian functionality. The journey between these 2 points was a journey from a performed domestic bliss to a brutal industrial reality. Windham Hill is the epitome of the modern American suburb. It is a master-planned community, a sprawling grid of winding streets, identical-looking homes with multi-car garages, and small, meticulously maintained green spaces. The names of the streets, Saratoga Trail, Heath Place, Silver Birch Boulevard, are themselves an exercise in marketing designed to evoke a sense of peaceful pastoral living. It is a place built on the promise of safety, community, and the quiet, predictable rhythms of family life. It was, in essence, a stage set, and for Shannon Watts, it was the perfect backdrop for the successful, aspirational life she was building and projecting to the world. The house itself was the central prop in this performance. Survey 319, by contrast, is a landscape stripped of all pretense. Located deep in the high plains of Weld County, it is a place that exists for a single brutal purpose: the extraction of resources from the earth. There are no landscaped lawns here, only gravel pads and prairie grass. There are no charming street names, only the cold, numerical designation of an industrial site. The defining features are pump jacks, pipelines, and the towering, anonymous shapes of storage tanks. The air smells of hydrocarbons and machinery. It is a world of dirt, steel, and a profound, windswept isolation. This was Christopher Watts's other world. It was the place he went every day to earn the money that funded the life on Saratoga Trail. It was a place of solitude, of long hours spent alone in his truck or working a wellhead. It was a landscape that was, in its starkness and isolation, a much truer reflection of his own internal emotional state. His choice of Survey 319 as the disposal site was no accident. It was a place of terrible practical convenience. It was a location he knew intimately, every dirt road, every blind spot. It was a place where a man in a company truck would not look out of place, even in the pre-dawn hours. And it offered a means of disposal, a deep, dark, industrial void that he believed would be final and absolute. Symbolically, the act of taking his family from the pristine stage set of Windham Hill and depositing them in the raw, industrial ugliness of Survey 319 was a final, violent rejection of the life they represented. He was not just killing them, he was taking them out of the perfect world Shannon had so carefully constructed and dumping them into his own world of cold, hard, industrial reality. It was a final, terrible act of reasserting control, a geographical manifestation of his desire to erase one life and fully inhabit another. The 45-minute drive between these two locations was a journey across a moral event horizon, from a world of performative love to one of absolute nihilism. A key element that distinguishes the Watts case from many other familicides is the chilling and well-documented prelude to the murders. Unlike cases where the violence seems to erupt from a sudden, unforeseen crisis, a look back at the final week of the Watts family's life reveals a man who was methodically, and almost subconsciously, laying the groundwork for his fresh start. While Shannon was away on her work trip to Arizona, Chris was not just a bachelor enjoying a temporary reprieve from family life. He was conducting a dress rehearsal for the life he intended to live permanently. This period from Friday, August 10th to Sunday, August 12th, was Chris's first real taste of extended, unencumbered freedom with Nicole Kessinger. Shannon was 1,000 miles away, consumed by her work event. For Chris, it was an opportunity to fully inhabit the role of the single dad, finalizing his divorce, the character he had created for his new girlfriend. His own statements to investigators, combined with Nicole Kessinger's account, paint a picture of a man shedding his old skin. He had taken the girls to a birthday party, where other parents noted his unusual and effusive chattiness, a stark contrast to his normally reserved demeanor. It was the performance of a man trying on a new personality, a more outgoing and confident version of himself. That weekend, he and Nicole went on their first real date, out in public, a significant escalation of their affair. He sent her selfies from his home, pictures of him looking relaxed and happy, as if the space was already his alone. They had long, intimate conversations about their future, discussing everything from living together to their long-term financial goals. He was, in essence, road testing his new life, and he had found that it fit him perfectly. This weekend dress rehearsal likely served as a powerful psychological catalyst. The intoxicating feeling of this new, easy life stood in stark contrast to the impending return of his old one. The life with Nicole was a fantasy of freedom and passion. The life with Shannon represented in his mind a reality of debt, obligation, and a personality he felt overshadowed by. The closer Shannon's flight home got, the more the two realities were on a collision course, and the more desperate his need for a permanent solution became. There was a subtle but telling detail from that final weekend. He had, at Nicole Kessinger's suggestion, made a concerted effort to start eating healthier. It was a small, seemingly insignificant change, but in the context of what was to come, it was deeply symbolic. He was not just changing his diet, he was changing his identity. He was divesting from the old Christopher Watts, the family man, and investing in a new, sleeker, unencumbered version, the man he believed Nicole Kessinger wanted. When Shannon's flight was delayed on Sunday night, pushing her arrival into the early hours of Monday morning, it was more than just a logistical inconvenience. For a man who had just spent 3 days living his fantasy future, every hour of that delay was another hour he had to inhabit a present he had already decided to annihilate. The stage was set. The actor had rehearsed his new role. All that was left was the final, brutal clearing of the stage. One of the most powerful and heartbreaking lenses through which to view the Watts tragedy is the extensive archive of text messages recovered from both Chris's and, more poignantly, Shannon's phones. These digital conversations, preserved with perfect clinical accuracy, are the modern-day equivalent of a victim's diary. They provide an unvarnished, real-time chronicle of a marriage in its final death spiral, a story told in the staccato, abbreviated language of our times. The messages from Shannon's phone in the weeks and months before her murder paint a portrait of a woman who was acutely aware that her marriage was in trouble, but who remained fiercely determined to save it. They show her shifting from a state of cheerful, public optimism to one of private, gnawing anxiety. Early in the summer of 2018, as Chris's affair with Nicole Kessinger was just beginning, Shannon's texts to her closest friends are filled with confusion and hurt. "He has changed," she wrote to one friend. "I don't know who he is. He doesn't touch me, he doesn't look at me, he doesn't talk to me anymore." She described a profound emotional and physical distance that had opened up between them, a coldness she could not comprehend. Her messages reveal a woman who was, by her very nature, a problem solver. She approached the crisis in her marriage with the same proactive, can-do attitude she applied to her business. She sent Chris articles on relationship building. She purchased self-help books. She desperately tried to initiate conversations to bridge the growing chasm between them. "I will never give up on him," she wrote to her friend Cassie. "He's my rock." Just days before her death, while in North Carolina visiting her family, her anxiety escalated into a near panic. A financial transaction had gone wrong, leading to a tense, accusatory text exchange with Chris. His responses, as seen in the recovered data, are clipped, cold, and dismissive. In her subsequent text to a friend, her pain and fear are palpable. "I miss the old Chris," she typed, her words a lament for a man who had already, in every way that mattered, left her. "He's cold as ice. I feel so lost. I don't know who to trust." The final text messages she sent from her last business trip in Arizona are a heartbreaking testament to her enduring but misplaced hope. She was flying home, and she was determined to make things right. She had missed her husband, her children, her home, and she believed, with a profound and tragic optimism, that their physical reunion would begin to heal the emotional rift. "I'm going to get back and snuggle with my babies and my hubby," she texted a friend from the airport, full of the weary anticipation of a traveler coming home. In stark contrast, the recovered text messages from Chris's phone to Nicole Kessinger from the same period tell a completely different story. They are filled with flirtation, with plans for the future, with the breathless excitement of a new romance. He was texting both women simultaneously, a digital puppeteer managing two completely separate and irreconcilable realities. The text messages are the ghosts in the machine. They are the record of a wife's desperate fight to save a family that her husband was secretly and methodically planning to destroy. Shannon's final texts, in their hopeful naivety, are perhaps the most tragic artifacts in the entire case. The last words of a woman flying home to a reunion that was, in fact, an ambush. The crime scene at 2825 Saratoga Trail presented a unique and confounding challenge for investigators. A crime scene, by definition, is a place where the order of normal life has been violently disrupted. It is a canvas of chaos, marked by the physical evidence of a struggle, overturned furniture, broken objects, bloodstains, and other telltale signs of a violent encounter. The Watts home was the terrifying inverse of this expectation. It was not a scene of chaos. It was a scene of profound, unnatural order. This very pristineness, the meticulous lack of any visible evidence, became, in a deeply ironic way, the most compelling evidence of all. When Detective Dave Baumhover and the first CBI agents began their initial, consent-based search of the house, they were struck by its immaculate condition. This was not just a tidy home, it was a scrubbed home. The floors were clean, the counters were wiped down, and there was no clutter. In a house with two young children, this level of cleanliness on a Monday afternoon was, in itself, an anomaly. This pristine state worked against Christopher Watts in two critical ways. First, it completely undermined any potential theory of a chaotic, unplanned event like a home invasion or a third-party abduction. An external attacker would have left traces of their entry and their struggle. The absence of any such evidence, no broken windows, no forced locks, no signs of a fight, immediately narrowed the focus of the investigation inward, to the people who had been present in the house that morning. Second, the cleanliness was inconsistent with Chris's own initial, fabricated story of a rage kill. A man who had just exploded in a blind, uncontrollable fury upon discovering his wife had killed their children would not, in the immediate aftermath, be in a state of mind to meticulously clean up the scene. Such a crime would be messy, emotional, and would leave a significant physical and emotional residue. The home Chris presented to the police was a sterile, dispassionate environment, a reflection not of a man who had lost control, but of a man who had been in terrifyingly complete control. The one singular point of disarray, the unmade bed in the master bedroom, became a focal point precisely because it was the only thing out of place. The investigators knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was where the violence had begun. It was the epicenter, the point of origin from which the subsequent methodical cleanup had radiated. Later, forensic teams using advanced techniques would search this area for trace evidence, but the scene had been so effectively sanitized by Chris that there was little for them to find with the naked eye. This lack of evidence became a key psychological indicator for the investigators. They were not dealing with a sloppy, impulsive killer. They were dealing with a thinker, a planner, a man who had consciously and deliberately tried to erase not just the lives of his family, but any physical trace of their final moments. He had been successful in removing the physical evidence, but he had failed to understand a fundamental truth of modern criminology. In the absence of a physical scene, the psychological and digital scenes become paramount. His perfectly clean house was a silent testament not to his innocence, but to the cold, calculated thoroughness of his guilt. The final act of disposal, placing the bodies of his two young daughters into separate crude oil tanks, is, for many, the single most incomprehensible and unforgivable aspect of Christopher Watts's crimes. It was an act of such calculated, industrial-scale desecration that it transcended the already horrific act of murder itself. To understand why he chose this specific, grotesque method requires a look into the chillingly pragmatic and deeply sociopathic logic of his plan. His primary, overarching goal, once the murders were committed, was concealment. He was not just trying to hide the bodies. He was attempting to achieve their complete and utter obliteration. He needed a method that would not only make them difficult to find, but would also, he likely hoped, destroy any and all physical evidence that could link him to their deaths. As an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, the oil fields were his domain. He understood the landscape, the isolation, and the industrial processes in a way no outsider could. He knew that the massive storage tanks, or batteries, were rarely accessed and were located in remote, desolate areas where he was unlikely to be seen or disturbed, especially in the pre-dawn hours. This was his turf, his world, and he was using his specialized, insider knowledge as a weapon. The choice of crude oil as a medium for concealment was a particularly insidious one. Crude oil is a complex and caustic chemical cocktail. He likely believed, in his layman's understanding of chemistry, that the corrosive properties of the oil would, over time, completely dissolve the bodies, erasing any trace of his daughter's existence. This was a tragically flawed assumption. The cold, oxygen-deprived environment of the tank would actually lead to a form of preservation, but it speaks to his intent. His goal was not just to hide, but to unmake. Furthermore, there was the ghastly physical challenge of the 8-inch thief hatch on top of the tanks. This was not a large, open vat he could simply drop the bodies into. The fact that he was able to force the small, flexible bodies of his children through an opening so small is a testament to a level of cold, mechanical determination that is almost beyond human understanding. It was a physical act that required strength, time, and a complete and total disassociation from the humanity of the victims. He was not handling his daughters. He was feeding a problem into an industrial disposal unit. This act, more than any other, demolishes any claim of a crime of passion. It was a cold, logistical, and time-consuming solution to a problem. It was planned. It was methodical. It required a series of deliberate and physically demanding steps. Ultimately, his choice of the oil tanks was a fatal miscalculation. While he had correctly identified a place of profound isolation, he had completely failed to account for the one thing he could not control or erase: the digital ghost of his own movements. He had banked on the physical world to keep his secrets, to dissolve the evidence of his crimes in a tomb of oil. He had failed to realize that the most powerful witness against him was a satellite in orbit, silently and impartially recording the coordinates of his every single monstrous move. In the anatomy of the Watts family's finances, one document stands as a stark, numerical testament to the pressures that formed the backdrop of the tragedy: their June 2015 Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing. This public legal record, filled with the cold, unforgiving language of assets and liabilities, provides a crucial, non-emotional counterpoint to the vibrant, successful image the couple curated on social media. It is a financial autopsy of a family living profoundly beyond their means, a situation that had been building for years. The filing, submitted to the United States Bankruptcy Court for the District of Colorado, tells a familiar story of modern American debt. At the time of the filing, Christopher and Shannon Watts listed total liabilities of $70,140 against total assets of just over $400,000, the vast majority of which was their newly purchased home in Frederick. The debt was a smorgasbord of consumer credit. thousands owed to major credit card companies like American Express, Chase, and Capital One, significant unpaid student loan debt for Shannon, and multiple medical bills in collections. Their monthly income at the time was listed as approximately $4,900, with Chris's salary from Anadarko as the primary source. Their monthly expenditures, however, were listed at nearly the exact same amount. A staggering $3,000 of that was their monthly mortgage payment. After paying for their cars, insurance, utilities, and groceries, the budget showed they were operating with almost zero disposable income. They were, in the most literal sense, one unexpected car repair or medical bill away from complete financial insolvency. This bankruptcy was not a shameful secret they kept hidden. In fact, Shannon, in her role as a motivational speaker and lifestyle coach for her MLM business, often used it as a part of her personal narrative. It was framed as a story of hitting rock bottom and then rising from the ashes through the financial opportunities provided by her company. It was a powerful and relatable rags-to-riches story that was a key part of her sales and recruitment pitch. "We went through the darkest time of our lives," she would say in her videos, "and now we are thriving." But the financial reality, even after the bankruptcy had wiped away their unsecured debts, remained precarious. The enormous mortgage on their large, newly built home was a non-negotiable, crushing weight. The pressure to maintain the image of the Thrive life, the nice clothes, the trips, the Lexus, meant that they were almost immediately back in a cycle of high spending. By the summer of 2018, just 3 years after their bankruptcy, they were facing legal action from their homeowners association for unpaid dues, a clear sign that the underlying financial instability had never truly been resolved. For Christopher Watts, a man who, by his own account, was not interested in the finer details of budgeting and finance, this constant pressure was a silent, grinding source of stress. In his mind, every purchase Shannon made, every trip she took for her business, was likely another debit against a life he felt was spiraling out of his control. While financial stress alone is never a justification for violence, it was undeniably a powerful accelerant in the Watts home. The dream house on Saratoga Trail, the symbol of their success, was also their financial prison. And for Chris, it was one more cage from which he felt an increasingly desperate need to escape. The first 48 hours of any high-profile, no body, missing persons investigation is a complex and delicate dance between public appeal and private suspicion. From the moment the case was escalated from a simple welfare check, the investigators in Frederick were operating on two distinct and parallel tracks. Publicly, Shannon, Bella, and Celeste were treated as endangered missing persons. Privately, they were treated as probable victims of a homicide, with their husband and father as the primary and only suspect. The public-facing strategy was executed with textbook precision. On Monday evening and throughout the day on Tuesday, the full force of a modern missing persons campaign was deployed. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation's Missing Endangered Alert was activated, ensuring the victims' faces and details were broadcast statewide. This was the broad net, cast in the hope of catching a crucial piece of information: a witness who saw a car, a person who had contact with Shannon, anything that could provide a lead. The media was engaged not as an adversary, but as a critical partner. Christopher Watts's on-camera plea on Tuesday was a calculated risk by the investigators. They did not prevent him from speaking. In fact, they subtly encouraged it, understanding that such a public performance could yield invaluable behavioral clues. It was a high-stakes play, but one that paid off handsomely, as his flat, emotionless affect provided them with a powerful piece of psychological evidence that reinforced their own suspicions. The public plea served its purpose. It generated a massive amount of media coverage, ensuring that the entire state was aware of the search. Simultaneously, the private investigation was moving at lightning speed, far from the glare of the cameras. This track was built on the quiet, methodical work of warrants, subpoenas, and data analysis. While Chris was performing for the news, a team of detectives and CBI agents was in the procedural trenches, writing the legal affidavits necessary to compel companies like Verizon, Google, and Anadarko Petroleum to turn over their data. This bifurcated approach is essential in a case like this. If by some remote chance, Shannon and the girls had left voluntarily or been taken by a third party, the public appeal was their best hope for a safe return. Announcing publicly that the husband was the prime suspect too early could have been a fatal error. It could have caused a real kidnapper to panic and harm the victims, or it could have completely compromised the investigation if their theory was wrong. By Wednesday, however, the two tracks had definitively merged. The data had come in. The GPS had pinpointed Survey 319. The digital evidence had confirmed the lies. At this point, the public pretense could be dropped, at least internally. The mission was no longer a search in the traditional sense. It was now a targeted operation, a focused effort to break the suspect and recover the bodies. This masterfully executed two-track strategy, the loud, public plea for help and the quiet, relentless private hunt for data, is a testament to the sophistication of modern homicide investigation. They were able to use Christopher Watts's own attempts at public manipulation as a tool against him, all while in the background, his own digital footprint was weaving the very net that would ultimately ensnare him. The first 48 hours were a perfect, tragic symphony of deception and detection. Central to the public's enduring fascination with the Watts case is the character of Shannon herself, a woman who was, in every sense of the word, a product of the 21st century. Her identity was not just lived, but actively constructed, curated, and broadcast to the world through the powerful prism of social media. This is not a judgment, but an observation of a cultural phenomenon that she had masterfully harnessed for both personal connection and professional success. Her tragic fate has made her a posthumous icon of the promises and perils of a life lived online. Shannon Watts was a native of North Carolina, a woman who, by her own account, had overcome significant health challenges, including a lupus diagnosis. This battle with her own health became a cornerstone of her personal narrative, a story of resilience and empowerment that she would later leverage with extraordinary success in her career. She met Chris, a quiet, unassuming man from the same area, and they began a life together that was, by all appearances, a modern American fairy tale. They moved to Colorado for Chris's job in the oil industry, bought a large new home, and had two beautiful daughters. Her discovery of the Lavelle Thrive product and the multi-level marketing world was a perfect marriage of her personality and her circumstances. The business model rewarded the very traits she possessed in abundance: effervescent charisma, a gift for personal connection, a relentless work ethic, and a mastery of the art of the social media narrative. She wasn't just selling a product, she was selling an idea, the idea of Shannon Watts, the successful, healthy, empowered boss mom who was living her best life and could help you live yours too. Her Facebook page was a meticulously maintained vision board of this life. There were polished, professional-looking photo shoots, candid videos of her energetic children, and inspirational posts about overcoming obstacles. Her content was a potent and highly effective mix of the aspirational and the relatable. This public persona, however, required constant maintenance. The performance of success had to be relentless, because in the world of MLMs, any crack in the facade, any hint of struggle or doubt can be fatal to the brand. This created an environment where the line between the private self and the public brand could become dangerously blurred. For Chris, a man who was pathologically private and non-confrontational, this life in the digital spotlight must have been, at times, a deeply alienating experience. He was a central character in a story that Shannon was writing and directing. His role was the rock, the adoring, supportive husband who was the quiet foundation for his wife's glittering success. In many of the videos, he can be seen in the background, a smiling but often passive participant. In the end, the very openness that had defined Shannon's life became the tool through which the world would come to understand the depth of her tragedy. Her own words and images, intended to inspire and sell, became her eulogy, a permanent, heartbreaking archive of a life of vibrant promise that was built, unknowingly, alongside a secret world of resentment, deception, and ultimately murderous intent. One of the most insidious and well-documented tactics of abusers in domestic settings is the weaponization of the couple's finances, a form of coercion and control that can be as damaging as any physical act. In the case of Christopher and Shannon Watts, a deep dive into their financial records, particularly in the weeks leading up to the murders, reveals not a partnership, but a battleground where money had become a potent symbol of their deeply fractured and unequal dynamic. While their shared 2015 bankruptcy spoke to a history of joint financial mismanagement, by the summer of 2018, the financial landscape had shifted. Chris was the stable, primary earner, his bi-weekly paycheck from Anadarko the predictable foundation upon which their precarious financial house was built. Shannon's income, by contrast, was highly variable and performance-based, subject to the peaks and valleys of sales and recruitment in her MLM business. This created a fundamental tension. His steady, blue-collar income was funding her aspirational, white-collar lifestyle brand. Recovered text messages from the summer of 2018 reveal that this tension had erupted into open conflict. A particularly telling exchange occurred while Shannon and the girls were in North Carolina for their final family visit. A check that Shannon had written had bounced, triggering a cascade of overdraft fees and a frantic, panicked text exchange between the two of them. Shannon's texts are a torrent of anxiety and frustration. She's trying to manage the situation from afar, desperately trying to understand how their account could be overdrawn. Chris's responses are a masterclass in passive-aggressive stonewalling. They are clipped, dismissive, and tinged with a cold, accusatory tone. He offers no solutions, only short, one-word answers, effectively shutting down the conversation and leaving her to spin in a cycle of worry. From a psychological perspective, this was a clear power play. Chris, who in his own mind felt powerless and controlled in the relationship, had found one arena where he held the ultimate leverage: the money. By being uncooperative, by withholding information or feigning ignorance about their finances, he could create chaos and distress for Shannon. It was a subtle, non-physical way of asserting dominance and punishing her for the pressures he felt she was placing on him. This financial control was deeply intertwined with his burgeoning affair. Nicole Kessinger was a financially independent woman with her own career. In his fantasy world with her, money was not a source of conflict, but a shared resource for building a future. In his reality with Shannon, money was a weapon, a source of constant stress, and a symbol of the obligations he was desperate to escape. A chilling detail that emerged in the investigation was that, in the days just before the murders, Chris had deliberately sold some of his daughter Bella's furniture for cash. It was a small, seemingly insignificant act, but in hindsight, it was deeply symbolic. He was not just cheating on his family emotionally. He was beginning to liquidate their shared life, piece by piece, converting their domestic world into the currency he would need for his fresh start. Money, in the end, was not just a stressor. It was a key part of his motive, the fuel for the escape he had planned, a plan that would ultimately be paid for not with dollars, but with the lives of his wife and children. The story of the Watts murders is, at its core, a story of two fundamentally different narratives colliding. The first narrative was the public one, a story of idyllic family life meticulously crafted and curated by Shannon for a social media audience. The second was the secret narrative, a story of resentment, betrayal, and murderous intent, written in the silent, private world of Christopher Watts's mind. For several weeks in the summer of 2018, he lived as the protagonist of both stories simultaneously, a feat of psychological compartmentalization that is central to understanding the crime. The public narrative, as seen on Shannon's Facebook, reached its zenith during their late July, early August family trip to North Carolina. The photos from that week are a highlight reel of domestic bliss. There are shots of Chris patiently helping the girls build a sandcastle on the beach, of him pushing them on a swing set, his face creased in a seemingly genuine, loving smile. Shannon's captions accompanying these photos are effusive and full of adoration. "This is what it's all about," she wrote on one. "My hubby is the best daddy in the world." She was, for her audience and for herself, reinforcing the brand of their perfect family. The secret narrative, however, was playing out on a different screen, in the encrypted and deleted world of Chris Watts's burner phone and his text exchanges with Nicole Kessinger. While he was physically present with his family in North Carolina, smiling for photos and playing the part of the devoted father, he was emotionally and psychologically 1,000 miles away, in a fantasy world with another woman. The time difference worked in his favor, allowing him to text Kessinger late at night, after Shannon and the girls were asleep, spinning his web of lies about his impending divorce and their bright, shared future. This duality is perhaps best encapsulated by a single, chilling anecdote from that trip. According to one of Shannon's friends, she had been reading a relationship self-help book during the vacation, desperately trying to find a way to reconnect with her emotionally distant husband. One evening, she read a passage aloud to him, a passage about physical intimacy and connection. He reportedly listened, nodded, and then, later that same night, after his wife was asleep, he sent a sexually explicit photo of himself to his mistress. This single act is a microcosm of his entire deception. To his wife's face, he was a passive participant in a conversation about saving their marriage. In secret, he was actively and enthusiastically investing in the relationship that would ultimately lead to her murder. This profound and sustained act of a double life is a hallmark of the self-gain family annihilator. The ability to maintain two completely separate and contradictory realities is not a sign of a man cracking under pressure. It is a sign of a profound and chilling lack of a moral core. There was no internal conflict, no guilt, no battle between two worlds. There was only the performance of one world while he quietly and methodically laid the groundwork for the permanent establishment of the other. The vacation was not a last-ditch effort to save a family. It was the final, hollow performance before the actor decided to burn the theater to the ground. While the murders themselves were a swift and brutal culmination, a psychological and criminological analysis of the weeks leading up to the crime reveals a man who was already engaged in a process of psychic annihilation. Before he physically killed his family, Christopher Watts had already, in his own mind, demoted them from the status of beloved family members to that of disposable objects. This mental process is a terrifying but critical precursor to the act of familicide, a necessary psychological step that allows the killer to overcome the most fundamental human taboos. The catalyst for this process was undoubtedly the affair with Nicole Kessinger. Their relationship provided him with a stark and deceptively simple before and after picture. His life with Shannon in his internal narrative was the before, a world of financial stress, perceived control, and domestic obligation. His life with Nicole was the after, a fantasy world of passion, freedom, and a new, more exciting version of himself. Once this binary was established in his mind, his family was no longer a living, breathing entity to be cherished. They were the personification of the before, the primary obstacle standing between him and his desired after. This dehumanization process is evident in the subtle but significant changes in his behavior that Shannon herself had been documenting in her texts to friends. His emotional withdrawal, his lack of physical affection, his cold and dismissive communication. These were not just the actions of a man having an affair. They were the actions of a man who was actively severing the emotional bonds that had once defined his role as a husband and father. He was unplugging himself from the family matrix. His internet search history in the weeks leading up to the murders, recovered by forensic investigators, provides a chilling digital record of this psychic annihilation. Amidst mundane searches for car parts and gym equipment were more sinister inquiries. He had spent hours looking at photos of Nicole Kessinger, obsessively studying the woman who represented his future. This intense focus on the new life was a way of mentally solidifying the fantasy, of making the after feel more real and attainable than the before. The decision to give away the girl's nut-based snacks to a coworker, something Shannon had mentioned with confusion in a text, is another small but telling example of this process. The nuts were a known danger to his daughters due to their allergies. His casual disregard for this fact was a subconscious, or perhaps even conscious, demonstration that their well-being, their very safety, was no longer a primary concern for him. He was already checking out, already divesting himself of the detailed, moment-to-moment responsibilities of a protective father. By the time Shannon's plane landed in Denver in the early hours of August 13th, the psychic annihilation was complete. The people she was coming home to in Chris's mind were no longer his wife and daughters. They were objects. They were problems. They were the final items on a grim, mental checklist that needed to be dealt with before his new, better life could begin. The physical violence was merely the final, gruesome ratification of a series of murders that he had already, in his own mind, committed long before. In the immediate aftermath of any horrific and high-profile crime, a parallel and often less visible investigation begins: the internal review. For the leadership of the Frederick Police Department and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the successful and rapid closure of the Watts case was a testament to the effectiveness of their protocols and the tenacity of their investigators. The arrest was made, a confession was secured, and a conviction was guaranteed, all within a matter of months. From a results-oriented perspective, it was a profound success. However, behind the scenes, every major case undergoes a meticulous after-action review, a process where every step of the investigation is scrutinized for strengths, weaknesses, and most importantly, lessons learned. The Watts case, despite its successful outcome, provided several critical learning opportunities that have since influenced police procedure. One of the most discussed points in these internal reviews was the initial handling of Christopher Watts himself. For the first 48 hours, he was, legally speaking, a cooperating witness and a grieving husband. He was allowed to remain in his home, to speak to the media, and to move about freely. This approach was a calculated risk, a necessary part of the two-track investigative strategy, but it was a risk nonetheless. In hindsight, knowing the full scope of his actions, the thought of a confessed family annihilator being allowed such freedom in the immediate aftermath of his crimes is a chilling one. While it ultimately paid off by allowing him to incriminate himself on camera, it highlighted the profound and difficult balancing act that law enforcement must perform between treating someone as a victim and investigating them as a suspect. The crucial role of the neighbor's security camera underscored a significant shift in modern policing. The investigation hinged on this single piece of private, citizen-owned technology. This has led to a much greater emphasis on the creation and maintenance of camera registries in many police departments. These are voluntary programs where residents and business owners can register the location of their external security cameras, allowing investigators in future cases to rapidly identify and request footage from potential digital witnesses, saving precious hours in the initial canvassing process. The polygraph examination, while not a new tool, was used in the Watts case with a kind of textbook clinical perfection. It wasn't just used to detect lies. It was used as a psychological lever to break a suspect who believed he was intellectually superior to his questioners. The transcript and the video of that process, the calm, methodical questioning, the scientific finality of the results, and the immediate pivot to a more empathetic, confession-driven interrogation, has become required viewing in many advanced detective training programs. Ultimately, the internal review of the Watts investigation confirmed the profound and irreversible shift in the hierarchy of evidence. A generation ago, a no-body, no physical evidence case would have been a prosecutor's nightmare, a long and arduous process of building a purely circumstantial case. In the 21st century, the digital evidence, the GPS, the cell phone records, the video footage, is so powerful and so irrefutable that it can, and in this case did, become the primary foundation of the entire case. The most enduring lesson from the Watts investigation is a simple one. The modern killer leaves a trail, and the most effective modern detective is the one who knows how to follow the ones and zeros. One of the most profound and disturbing questions that the Christopher Watts case forces us to confront is the nature of the mask of sanity. Coined by the pioneering psychiatrist Hervé Cleckley, this term describes the ability of a psychopathic individual to present a perfectly normal, often charming, and utterly convincing facade to the outside world, all while concealing a complete and utter void of empathy, remorse, and genuine human emotion. Christopher Watts has become, for the 21st century, a quintessential and terrifying case study in this phenomenon. By all external metrics, Chris was the antithesis of a stereotypical killer. He was not a loner, not a brooding and angry presence. He was a husband, a father of two, a man with a steady job and a home in the suburbs. Friends, neighbors, and even Shannon's own family described him in consistently benign terms: quiet, shy, calm, easygoing. In the carefully curated world of Shannon's social media, he was the rock, the strong, silent type, the perfect, supportive partner to her vibrant, outgoing personality. He had perfected the art of the normal, unassuming man. This mask was not a clumsy or ill-fitting one. It was a masterpiece of social camouflage. He was able to seamlessly navigate the complex emotional landscape of family life, birthdays, holidays, vacations, all while, as he later admitted, feeling increasingly disconnected and resentful. He could smile for a family portrait moments after sending a deceitful text to his mistress. He could comfort his father-in-law on the phone, feigning concern for his missing family, just hours after he had murdered them and disposed of their bodies. The porch plea to the media was perhaps the mask's most audacious public appearance. He stood before the world and performed the role of a grieving husband with a studied, but ultimately flawed precision. For many, the performance was convincing, but for the trained eyes of the investigators, the mask was slipping. The lack of genuine, uncontrolled emotion, the subtle, self-centered phrasing, the inappropriate micro-expressions, these were the small tells that betrayed the emptiness behind the performance. His final confession in the Wisconsin prison was the moment the mask was, for the first time, completely and voluntarily removed. In his flat, monotonous retelling of the murders, he was no longer performing. He was simply reporting, with the detached clarity of a man who saw his family's annihilation not as a human tragedy, but as a logistical problem he had solved. The terrifying lesson of Christopher Watts and his mask of sanity is the profound unknowability of the human heart. His case serves as a chilling reminder that the capacity for extreme, calculated evil is not always written on the surface. It does not always manifest in overt acts of aggression or antisocial behavior. Sometimes, it wears the face of the quiet man next door, the devoted husband, the loving father. And it is this terrifying paradox, the chasm between the ordinary, likable facade and the monstrous reality it conceals, that is the reason the Christopher Watts story will forever haunt the American psyche. The narrative of Shannon Watts is inextricably linked to her identity as a thriver, a top-tier promoter for the multi-level marketing company Lavelle. To understand the world she inhabited, and the immense pressures that came with it, one must look at the specific culture and business model of the company she had dedicated the last years of her life to. Lavelle, like many MLMs, sells not just a product, but a lifestyle, and Shannon had become one of its most visible and successful evangelists. Founded in 2012, Lavelle promotes a premium lifestyle through its flagship product, Thrive, a 3-step daily regimen of capsules, shakes, and a wearable patch called a DFT dermafusion technology that supposedly delivers nutrients directly through the skin. The company's marketing is a masterclass in aspirational branding, focusing less on the scientific claims of the product and more on the transformative life experiences of its promoters. The business model is classic MLM. Promoters earn money in two primary ways: by selling the product directly to customers, and more lucratively, by recruiting others to join their downline. A promoter earns a commission not just on their own sales, but on the sales of every single person they have recruited, and the sales of the people those recruits have recruited, and so on. This creates a powerful, almost irresistible incentive to focus on recruitment over retail sales. Success in this world is highly public and performance-based. Lavelle, in particular, is known for its lavish rewards for high-achieving promoters. The Lexus bonus, a monthly car payment allowance for those who reach a certain rank, was a central and highly coveted status symbol within the company culture. Shannon, having achieved this status, often featured her white Lexus in her videos and posts. It was a tangible, rolling billboard for her success. The company also offered all-expenses-paid lifestyle getaways to exotic locations, the very kind of trip she was on in Arizona just before her death. This culture creates a high-pressure environment where the promoter's own life becomes the primary advertisement. Authenticity is a key part of the brand, but it is a curated authenticity. Promoters are encouraged to share their story, which often involves a narrative of overcoming hardship, illness, financial struggle, etc., through the power of the product and the business opportunity. Shannon's own story of battling health issues and a previous bankruptcy was a perfect fit for this model, and she told it with a passion and conviction that was undeniably compelling. The dark side of this model, as highlighted by critics of the MLM industry, is that it can create an unsustainable and often illusory image of success. While a tiny percentage of top-level promoters like Shannon could earn a significant income, the vast majority of participants earn very little, with many losing money after factoring in the cost of purchasing the product for themselves. For Shannon, Lavelle was more than a job. It was a calling, a community, and a core part of her identity. It gave her a platform for her natural talents as a communicator and a motivator. But it also locked her, and by extension her family, into a relentless and exhausting performance of a perfect, thriving life. A performance that, in the end, stood in stark and tragic contrast to the crumbling reality behind the scenes. While the criminal justice system delivered its verdict with the finality of a life sentence, another, more public and chaotic form of judgment was playing out in the digital town square. From the moment the news of Christopher Watts's arrest broke, the case became a global phenomenon, a dark obsession for a vast and diverse online community of true crime enthusiasts, amateur sleuths, and conspiracy theorists. This digital aftermath is a powerful and often troubling case study in the way modern society processes, and sometimes distorts, true crime. The sheer volume of publicly available evidence, the discovery files, the police interviews, Shannon's own extensive social media archive, provided an unprecedented amount of raw material for this online ecosystem. YouTube channels dedicated to the case sprung up overnight, their creators dissecting every frame of body camera footage, analyzing Chris's microexpressions, and offering theories that ranged from the insightful to the profoundly outlandish. Podcasts devoted entire series to the case, and Facebook groups and Reddit threads became sprawling, 24/7 forums for discussion and debate. In many ways, this intense public scrutiny served as a form of communal grieving and a search for understanding. People were horrified and captivated by the story, and the online world provided a space to share those feelings, to collectively try to make sense of an act that defied all human sense. This digital community was also instrumental in keeping the memory of the victims alive, sharing photos and videos of Shannon, Bella, and Celeste in happier times, ensuring they were remembered as more than just names in a case file. However, this digital firestorm also had a deeply problematic side. The line between analysis and speculation, between honoring the victims and exploiting their tragedy, was often blurred. The intense focus on Shannon's character, with many commentators engaging in blatant victim blaming, was a stark example of the toxic potential of this online culture. She was posthumously psychoanalyzed, her every word and action scrutinized, and often twisted to fit a preconceived narrative. Conspiracy theories flourished in the darker corners of this world. Theories that Chris had an accomplice, that Nicole Kessinger was more involved than the evidence suggested, or even that Shannon herself was not the innocent victim she appeared to be, gained traction despite being completely unsubstantiated by the official investigation. These theories, often presented in slickly produced YouTube videos, took on a life of their own, creating a parallel, fictionalized version of the case that existed entirely outside the bounds of established fact. For the Arzusek family, this digital afterlife was a constant and unavoidable source of pain. They were forced to watch as their daughter's life and death became content, fodder for a ceaseless and often reckless cycle of online commentary. The same social media that Shannon had used to build her life and community had, in her death, become a chaotic and often cruel circus built around her family's unimaginable tragedy. This phenomenon is a powerful, if unsettling, legacy of the case, a stark illustration of the complex and often troubling relationship between true crime, public fascination, and the ethics of the digital age. When the final report on the Watts family murders was bound and filed, when the last piece of evidence was logged and stored, the case, in a legal and procedural sense, was complete. The who, what, where, and when had been established with a chilling and absolute certainty. The why, in its most basic prosecutorial sense, had been labeled: an affair, financial pressure, the selfish desire for a fresh start. And yet, for every single person who had touched the case, from the first responding officer to the lead CBI agents to the district attorney himself, a profound and haunting sense of incompleteness remained. They had solved the crime, but they had not solved the man. Christopher Watts, in the end, remains the case's dark, impenetrable core, an enigma wrapped in the placid and unassuming shell of a suburban father. The sheer volume of evidence, the hours of confession, the thousands of digital artifacts, none of it has ever been sufficient to bridge the chasm between the man the world saw and the monster he became. You can put a label on the motive, District Attorney Michael Rourke would reflect, grappling with the same question that haunts the public. You can call it selfishness, you can call it narcissism, but those are just legal and psychological labels for a moral void. They don't explain the how. How does a human being, a father, drive his living children to their own execution site after murdering their mother? How does he listen to his 4-year-old daughter plead for her life and still go through with it? There is no legal statute, no psychological diagnosis that can truly contain the answer to that. The Watts case is a profound and terrifying paradox. In an era of unprecedented transparency, where a family's entire life is documented and a killer's every lie is recorded, we have more information about this crime than perhaps any other in modern history. We can see what they ate, hear how they spoke, read their most intimate fears and desires. We have a 5-hour, first-hand account of the murders from the killer himself. And yet, all of this information, this mountain of data, serves only to make the central act more incomprehensible, not less. The ultimate tragedy of the story is the collision of a vibrant, striving, life-affirming force in Shannon Watts with the quiet, passive, nihilistic void that was her husband. She was a woman who was building a business, a family, a future. He was a man who, in the end, was only capable of destruction. He did not possess the strength of character to build a new life honestly, so he chose the coward's path of annihilating the old one. He was a ghost in his own life story, a man so disconnected from the basic tenets of human empathy that he could look into the terrified eyes of his own child and see not a daughter, but a problem to be solved. And it is this final, unanswerable question, the question of how such an absolute emptiness can exist behind such an ordinary face, that ensures the story of Christopher Watts will forever serve as a chilling and cautionary tale, a permanent and disturbing fixture in the landscape of American crime.